there, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Periodic Table. This is number 2, right? And we're thrilled to have Mark Shepski of Shepski and Associates here with us to talk everything supply chain. He has a very deep career in the supply chain transportation world, and we'd love to pick his brain a little bit on everything that he's seeing and kind of what he predicts the future to be. So welcome, Mark.
Hey, thanks, Seth. Thanks for having me here today. Looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Well, good. So am I. So you've had this tremendous journey, right? Been with some of the most iconic companies in the world. I'd love to hear it from your perspective in terms of just what are the things that were most memorable, the things that you really took away from those various kind of experiences, and love for you to touch on a couple of those companies so that people can really understand the depth and breadth of the kind of exposure you've had.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been a privilege of mine to work for both sides of the industry, whether it's the service provider side, where I've worked for SEVA, Eagle Global Logistics, and Expeditors, and also to be on the shipper side, where I've had the opportunity to work at Nike, The Gap, Starbucks, and then lastly, Nestle. It's an interesting perspective. When I was on the 3PL side, the SEVA, the Expeditors, really watching the industry change in terms of digitizing the industry and seeing what they were doing from platforms where they were engaged with how to operate and execute to support the customer, to being on the shipper side, where you're on the other side of that coin and you're also looking to digitize, but you also have all the other aspects of the value chain that you're working through, whether it's the manufacturing and the planning, and how do you address those needs, to the distribution and what we typically think of as the supply chain, which is that planning, distribution, deployment, and
Right.
manufacturing piece. And all these companies, whether it's retail, whether it's CPG, whether it's the QSR, the quick serve restaurant, they all have a kind of a perishable nature to them, right? And so that ability to meet the consumer's needs or the customer's needs in a really fast manner is absolutely critical. And so the different organizations had different approaches in terms of how they did that. You look at Starbucks, where you've got the mobile order and pay, which really accelerates
a lot.
what people do, and it's just everywhere now, and it's so expected. Every time I get my Starbucks coffee, I use it. To what, say, Nestle is doing in terms of how they might be looking at the customer and the consumer, and how they're engaging with their customer to support the needs of the end consumer together. And then finally, looking across those, how are you driving efficiencies? What is that data and that ability to use that data in a most effective manner, so that you're maximizing your cost, your efficiencies, and again, I go back to that whole point about meeting the customer, meeting the consumer in a much faster manner.
I think that those are ultimately delivering that customer service is what a lot of these organizations are striving for. And I'm curious, you've seen a lot, you probably have a lot of war stories, right? From the many Black Friday or holiday time periods, or name your favorite kind of economic event. But I'm curious to get just some perspective on, given these really, really complex supply chains, global supply chains, what are the innovations and or technologies that you've seen, been a part of, that you think have been the most impactful to those organizations?
We can take a step back, and there's a lot of conversation that's happened about visibility. And again, I remember visibility at one point in time was Excel spreadsheets and emails, right? Where's my container? Where's my load? Where's my freight? Right. And calling everybody up, trying to figure out where it was at, to the point where you see a little bit more today in terms of that visibility that's available to most shippers, right? Through some third-party platforms that have been developed over time and have really kind of accelerated the industry. And so they've done a tremendous job in terms of, again, putting that into a digital format so that you can access it very quickly and very readily to see and understand where your freight is at any given point. With some, there's still, I think, a journey for that in terms of the opportunity. Some of the other things too is the predictive nature of some of this. right? I remember working for one of the large global companies, and there was an incident where some of the overseas factories had some issues, some labor issues, and had some other issues where some of the factories actually burnt down. We had to very quickly figure out where was the inventory that we had, which products were impacted, and then where was production going to shift to still meet that demand. Because when you talk about a factory that's completely destroyed, you can't just readily just stand another one up. You have to use what's in the system. And so at that point in time, I'd say we were still relatively early in terms of the ability to capture that level of visibility. But the organization that we were working with, we'd worked very closely with them to develop this visibility platform that was down to a SKU level. And so we were able to really quickly understand where we're at and then make decisions otherwise, and also talk to our customers, because clearly customers and consumers were going to be impacted because of the manufacturer cycle, the lead time cycle, and we needed to make some shifts and even substitute in some instances. I think we've come a long way even from that, because that would go back to, I want to say 2011, give or take, to where we're at today, where we have a much more granular ability to get to that level of detail at a keystroke.
I mean, you talk about visibility, and I think I'd be curious to understand whether you feel like visibility is a product or is it a feature at this point, right? Because there are companies like Project 44, Kites, and others that really, I think, they indoctrinated the market to visibility at some level and tried to democratize that for their customers. What's your sense today? How does that function?
I would say it's still a product. It's not a feature yet.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is because I still think it's not a fully realized product. It's still journey. Again, I mentioned that ability to kind of go back and try to figure things out was a lot of effort before in the past. It's gotten better over time, and now I know where things are. And then there's some predictive aspects of that. Say, hey, if a truck departs point A to point B, it should get there in 2 days. I'm making up a number. Right? But I think the other aspect that hasn't realized yet is that it's two pieces. The first one being the insight that comes on that. Okay, it's predictive, and here's another decision point you can make to make it better, because we know through some of the data that's been collected that there's some road hazards, or every Thursday when you go into this facility, they're backed up by 2 hours or 4 hours or whatever the number might be. So I think there's that aspect. And then the other one is the in-transit aspect. And I think it's a very difficult hurdle to overcome. But when something's on the road or something's in motion and there's an impact to its delivery time, or there's an impact to the need, right? Maybe something's in an ocean container and it's more critical. How do you get to that? How do you get that signal, and how can you take that action in the most effective, in a manner that's very effective? And how do you let the tools drive that so that the operators can be more focused in terms of bigger picture solutions and things of that nature? They're not just focused on watching every individual shipment. And for the most part, it's a managed by exception world,
Sure.
At least in the larger shippers now.
Yeah.
But you're still talking about scale and magnitude here. And then when those events do happen, they tend to be, there's something that's involved, whether it's a launch, whether it's something critical that's a need, and how do you address that in the most effective manner?
I mean, ultimately it comes down to the data, right? And I know you're a data guy, right? And you've been very focused on that, whether it be your procurement history or your operating experience. How do you see the use of data in the supply chain world today, in transportation, helping to manage those exceptions? Are we doing a good job? Like, how would you rate us? A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? Because I think that it's really hard. I think people think that they can throw this data into a database and call the job done. But to make really intelligent leverage of those assets, is a really difficult job to be done. What are your thoughts?
Putting a grade on it's pretty hard, because I would say that most organizations are working diligently to do the right things, working to deliver the right solutions for their customers and their consumers. But I still think that the data, there's so much data. You're talking about big systems of systems, and then you're talking about the trucking company's data and the ocean freight carrier company's data, and then your transportation data in your organization, and then your planning's organization's data, and then the deployment and all of those other things that come together. And that's a lot of data to maintain. An example I might give here is if it's not right, if it's not maintained right, if everybody can try and do all the right steps and the right processes, and you get to the fact that you loaded this truck and the doors are open and you're putting the last trailer on it, or the last pallet on it, I should say, and it's sticking off the back end. And it's because your master data, somewhere along the line, some master data didn't get maintained. And so those cartons are wrong size or something like that. And so then you run into a situation where you're potentially letting down your customer, and you're running into a fine situation, and you're running into all the other work that has to be done by the operators to still ensure things move as effectively as they can. And when you spend a one-off shipment level, it's not a big deal. But when you're talking about thousands of shipments for an individual shipper potentially, and then multiply that by all of the shippers and then the global side of it, those numbers can get really large, and that's a ton of waste in the system. And so I think that there's a lot of work to be done yet, especially from an integrated planning all the way to an integrated logistics and distribution component that is yet to be cracked. And there's some smart people out there that are working on it, but it is a difficult puzzle, and the pieces are always moving. And then you throw in different things that happen, things that nobody plans for, a hurricane, a typhoon, potential labor action, or something of that nature. And so that then you've got that variable that nobody can plan for that disrupts what the normal flow.
I think you touch on a really important point, is the variability. We think that data is intrinsically ones and zeros, right? It's very binary, which it is. But the genre of data and how you end up interpreting that data and applying that data, I think is a really important point, and something that a lot of these organizations, like you said, are trying to crack, right? Because if you can't connect it throughout the supply chain, then ultimately you're not driving value, which kind of leads me to my next question, which is, I hear this term value chain a lot. I've used it a couple times, right? As many folks who know me would attest to. Talk to me about like how you see that term, right? Because I think it can be used in a variety of different ways, especially as it pertains to the supply chain.
If you look at the definition, it's basically everything from the product idea to the customer, right? That's the value chain. And when you start thinking in terms of the supply chain component of it, which is manufacturing, it's the sourcing of materials, raw materials, it's the distribution, deployment of those materials, it's the final delivery to the customer, and sometimes even to the floor of a facility or a sales location. So the value chain is very all encompassing, and when people blend those two, they're talking about how do they address the needs of the customer, because you can think in terms of value chain. If you go all the way up to how do you plan the packaging so that you are delivering a product that's more effective from a distribution standpoint, but even more pleasing to a customer, right? I think about Fiji water bottles, because you see a lot of different water bottles, and I don't have any experience with this. I'm just, this
Sure.
is an observation, but you see a lot of water bottles are round, have that round shape, but the Fiji water bottles square, right? Mm-hmm. And if you think about putting things into a carton or onto a pallet, square makes more sense. And so just things like that, and they've used that in terms of their branding, so that value chain aspect, and other companies have done that, with packaging, with product design, and there's a whole idea of design to value, and so how that all comes into this. But again, coming back into the supply chain aspect, how does that then translate, whether or not you're doing your master cartons to your inner sleeves, whether or not it's footwear and you're maximizing the space, on an ocean vessel in terms of how many shoes you can get on that, or on a place to another, where even things like, again, at a quick serve restaurant, you have a delivery that has to happen to replenish that facility every day, right? Sometimes even more than once a day, depending upon the facility.
Right.
And so are you designing your back office? Are you designing that refrigerator and freezer space for that food product? Again, you also have the added need of food safety and all of that to bring that together. So it's a really very big perspective, and it's still uneven in terms of people's thoughtfulness in terms of how to approach it and how they connect.
I think it's a definition that is a little nebulous, but it continues to evolve. And it's something that I think organizations need to apply the lens to their mission, their vision, their own values, and what they do and how they do it. So it was a really good set of feedback. You mentioned like packaging and cartons, and I think about the work that you did with Nike and the shoes and some of the ESG type of focus that many global organizations, global 2000 organizations are heavily invested in. Is it real? Is it pomp, circumstance, right? Is it something that you have seen translate to action? Or is it just, well, we want to rationalize what we do in a feel-good kind of manner? Like, I mean, we would all say that, I think that, the environment is an important thing to, how we live and breathe. What's your take?
It's real. I'm going to put an asterisk with that, though.
Okay.
It's not just environment, it's also people, it's also labor, especially when you're talking about global labor and things of that nature. And we're talking about for-profit companies. And there's nothing wrong for a company to be making profit. But there's also the added burden, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, it's almost like stewardship at that scale to say, what are you doing to continue to not only advance your product for your customer and consumer, but also to advance and support where you touch the world, right? Whether it's your manufacturing base, your supply base, and how you move it and distribute it and so forth. And so different organizations, especially the larger global organizations, have this as a priority, and they're making efforts and taking efforts. And it's a complex puzzle. At the end of the day, it's hugely complex. And so companies are getting after this, but there's even things such as, think about moving a truck down the road. Okay, trucks have a weight limitation that they can have and how many axles they have as they move down the road, and then it's almost how much space is in that truck. Well, diesel trucks already have that accounted for. Now you're going to battery or looking at battery trucks. Well, the weight differential is so much higher, and then the space for those batteries. So all of a sudden, you're kind of doing this counterbalance between you're moving a truck, but you get less stuff on it, right? And so then you have to move more of these trucks. Now, granted, they're not necessarily putting out the same CO2 footprint, but enough of them on the road creates other different types of congestions and unintended consequences. I think we're still trying to figure out what is that EV or alternative fuel type of situation the world's going towards. Ocean freight and air freight are in different spaces. Ocean freight and rail have a much lower CO2 footprint. So moving those, and some of the ocean carriers are making very significant investments in terms of hull design and types of vessels and types of fuels that they're using. And so then you maximize how much you can get on those boats. The boats have gotten bigger, so the CO2 footprint per each one of those in each product has gotten smaller. And then you have some other commodities that are needing to move via air freight because of very specific needs and reasons. And air freight has a very substantial CO2 footprint. They're trying to be more thoughtful about the decision process, and it's also much more expensive additionally. So there's a real focus, and I just stayed in the transportation and distribution space and talked about manufacturing, and can you look at things like solar opportunities or look at wind opportunities. Companies are making efforts. We're still very early. There's some things that are a little bit more mature, but they're still not, even though they're reasonably mature, they're not adopted holistically, and they may not work in one location. Solar in Arizona makes a lot of sense. I'd say solar in Seattle might be a little bit more problematic, right?
You mentioned the flight, right? Transportation, aircraft transportation. And I see in our consumer worlds where they put the CO2 emissions of a particular plane. I have to admit that I've never contemplated taking one flight over another because of the emissions, right? So we'll see whether or not that kind of evolves into our decision-making kind of process. Who knows? Maybe it's price and timing and things like that. Absolutely. We'll have to see.
Absolutely.
But along those lines, EVs, robotics, like there's a lot of things changing. I remember I was at Manifest a couple years ago and everything was robots, right? DHL was doing a presentation on, how they've automated the warehouse and their spaces to pick and pack in a much more efficient way. But what's your take on the robotics space and this evolution and maybe how that pairs with, what we're seeing in AI and so on?
It's definitely advanced, right? You're seeing different facilities look at how they can streamline the different types of picks, different types of pallet moves. There's a potential for increased or enhanced safety. There's this idea of how do you take out some of the work that maybe even dangerous and put it in a space where the robots can do it better. An example is again, one organization I was at went to automate a facility. The cherry pickers, right? The pallet grabbers, right? For not being technical here, they would move slower than their human counterpart, right? Human counterpart was so much faster coming in there, grabbing the pallet, doing the move and doing what they needed to do. But they would come in and they would line up and get everything right and then do the move and then, move around. But the thing was that they could operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? So on an individual move, they're slower, but on an aggregate, they're moving more product. Now, nobody wants teams working 24/7. There's a whole at night circadian rhythm thing. And again, I go back to the safety component. And it's also the idea of how do we provide a better life. And then you think in terms of the opportunities as you build these robots. They need to be maintained. They need people to code. They need people to do all of the work to support, the technical work to support them. And that's an opportunity to continue to enhance the workforce and work with it and use that automation, whether it's robotics, whether it's AI, or any of the other technologies that are out there to continue to develop that skill set over time and again, make things more efficient and safe.
I think safety paramount, but also these jobs change. And I think that that's part of the best companies in the world will evolve and make sure that their way of operating, way of executing conforms to embracing these new technologies, these new opportunities, whether it's robotics, whether it's AI, and I don't consider like jamming stuff into ChatGPT, right, a strategic advantage. I think but really kind of pushing these ideas to the edge and, making the best use of them. I think we've seen a lot in the last 12 to 24 months in the AI world. And, that kind of innovation is pretty cool. I mean, it's fundamentally changing, much like the internet, how we live and breathe and do our jobs. What are the coolest things that you've seen? And since it's this festive time of year, like we're recording this in December, like if I had $5 million that I could just give to you in kind of a Santa Claus kind of way, like where would you put it? Like what would you bet on? And what would you hope to get from it?
Yeah, I mean, look, my head goes to kind of simulation and sense and response and how you can use that to be more effective in terms of your planning and your execution. The digital twins have been out there and people discuss that and they've kind of trying to figure out how to use them, and then that simulation piece and how to do that in a real end-to-end perspective. Because I think that there's places where it's developed reasonably well, like planning, but I think that there's areas where it still hasn't. And I think that there's a complexity, especially in the logistics or the transportation space, because you're dealing with systems of systems. You're dealing with thousands of these smaller trucking companies, right? These people that own 6 trucks or less. And so they don't necessarily have, say, the technology. And so how do they interface with some of this other technology? And then as a large shipper, you don't have just one small trucking company you work with. You have a handful, multitude of trucking companies you're engaged with, and all of them with varying different capacity related to that, say, that technology aspect. So how do you provide this simulation and sense and response and integrate them into it in a way that's meaningful so that you're engaged and you're delivering across the system of systems in a more efficient way? So if there was something I had several $1 million to focus on in terms of that, it would be that. How do you look at integrating these systems of systems to make them flow better than they are today? And again, I go back to what I said earlier. There's going to be disruptions. There's going to be an accident on a freeway, which, again, is awful, and hate to have those types of things happen, or a hurricane or something of that nature. So they're going to disrupt the system regardless. But what can you do to try to mitigate that or manage through that? And what is perfect, or what should perfect look like? And then what's your upper and lower limits as you try to navigate through that? And coupled onto that, though, I think is again, just that idea that the workforce, right? And making sure organizations are taking the time to train people as they look ahead, right? There's so much speed to the technology and AI, and I had the benefit of being in a beta group, in an organization when we were looking at bringing on AI and testing it and testing our own internal version of ChatGPT. That was really my first experience. So I'm really thankful for that experience, but I don't know if organizations have that, and I don't know how widespread that ability of people to get to that level of learning, because I think that there's so many intelligent people out there, and leveraging the teams to really look at, how can I use this, and how can I use this to make the world better?
I think a lot of people are very content with kind of operating, right? I joke around that I was floored many years ago with how tolerant the supply chain community, transportation community was with just operating, right? Showing up, executing, rather than innovating. And I think that finally kind of this digitization has come. The data has gotten to a level and that it's accessible. The agendas have mandated that in order to be more efficient and effective and profitable, people are investing more in these areas. So it's an exciting time for the space. Certainly super appreciative of your time, Mark. Anything else that you're excited as we go into this 2025 year and kind of what you're interested to see?
Maybe a little off the technology piece, but again, how the technology comes into it is, I think we're really finally coming out of COVID and hitting and resetting what the normal is.
Yeah.
And we talked about data. You're trying to use this data to make informed decisions. Well, you had this big blip over the last 4 or 5 years that really kind of was the outlier. So now we're kind of coming back into normal. And I think what it's going to hopefully do, and again, normal is a relevant term here, there's still going to be bumps, but it's going to allow the data to kind of catch up to some of the technology to really it'll become more useful, and it'll really allow those either incremental or big disruptive changes to happen with the technologies that we hadn't been able to really get there because we weren't clear in terms of what the baseline was truly.
Sure.
Like 2025 is going to be resetting that. I think that, there's a couple of things on the horizon, and I think, we're going to navigate through that. But it's an exciting year, I think, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with it.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Mark Shepski, heralded career, right? So excited to see kind of what you're getting into next now that you can kind of use your experience with Nestle, Starbucks, others, right? Nike as a platform for incremental change with the different organizations, different startups that you work with. Thank you again, and we'll hopefully get to reconvene in 2025.
Appreciate it, Seth. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon.